The moment someone decides they already know who you are, the truth becomes the most dangerous thing they will ever discover. On an unusually clear Tuesday morning just outside downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, traffic moved with its familiar rhythm as commuters hurried toward offices, delivery trucks rolled through green lights, and coffee shops welcomed the first rush of customers. Among the steady flow of vehicles, one black Lamborghini Urus glided through the city with quiet confidence. It did not roar through intersections or demand attention. It simply moved with effortless precision, its polished finish reflecting the early sunlight as though the entire city existed inside its mirror-like surface. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Bennett, a 44-year-old black man dressed in a tailored navy suit without a tie, his left hand resting lightly on the steering wheel while soft instrumental music filled the cabin. His expression remained calm, focused, almost thoughtful, as though his attention rested on something much larger than the morning commute. Few people who glanced toward the luxury vehicle realized that the man driving it carried no desire to impress strangers. For Marcus, the Lamborghini represented years of sacrifice, discipline, and difficult choices rather than status. He had learned long ago that appearances often inspired assumptions, and assumptions could become dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. Several blocks behind him, Officer Ryan Coleman eased his marked patrol vehicle into the same lane. The experienced white police officer had spent nearly 12 years wearing the badge, and somewhere along the way confidence had quietly transformed into certainty. He believed he could identify suspicious behavior almost instantly. To him, instinct had become more valuable than patience, and first impressions often outweighed careful verification. As the Lamborghini came into full view, Coleman narrowed his eyes. Expensive vehicles always caught his attention, but today something else seemed to reinforce the story already forming inside his mind. He watched Marcus through the side window for only a few seconds before convincing himself that something did not belong. Officer Daniel Harris, riding in the passenger seat, noticed the silence. He glanced toward the Lamborghini and then back at his partner. "Everything looks normal," he said casually. Coleman never looked away from the vehicle. "Does it?" he answered. Harris studied the traffic once more. The driver obeyed every speed limit. Every lane change was properly signaled. The registration plate appeared current. Nothing about the vehicle suggested reckless behavior or criminal activity. Yet Coleman continued following at a steady distance, his confidence growing stronger with every passing block despite the complete absence of evidence. Marcus remained completely unaware that someone had already begun writing a story about him without knowing a single fact. He slowed for a red light, waited patiently behind two family sedans, and continued driving toward police headquarters for an appointment that could not be delayed. His phone remained untouched. His attention stayed on the road ahead. Everything about his conduct reflected patience and discipline. Then the flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Drivers nearby immediately moved aside as Marcus calmly activated his turn signal and guided the Lamborghini onto a wide shoulder beneath a row of oak trees. He switched off the engine, lowered the driver's window, and placed both hands where they could be clearly seen. Coleman stepped out of the patrol vehicle with measured confidence, while Harris followed several steps behind, quietly observing the scene. As Coleman approached the driver's window, his eyes traveled across the luxury interior before settling on Marcus. Without offering a greeting or explaining the reason for the stop, he spoke in a firm voice that carried more suspicion than professionalism. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. "We need to have a conversation before you go anywhere." 45 minutes earlier, the city had looked completely different. The streets were quieter, the air carried the cool freshness of early morning, and the rising sun painted long golden reflections across the glass buildings of downtown Raleigh. Marcus Bennett left a modest business hotel carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio and a travel coffee mug. Anyone watching him would have assumed he was another executive preparing for an ordinary workday. That quiet anonymity suited him perfectly. Throughout his entire career, Marcus had learned that genuine leadership rarely announced itself before entering the room. It revealed itself through actions, not introductions. He paused briefly beside the black Lamborghini Urus parked near the entrance and looked toward the skyline. This city was about to become home in a very different way. Years of service in another department had prepared him for difficult decisions, impossible conversations, and public scrutiny, but no amount of experience could completely remove the weight of accepting responsibility for an entire police department. He understood that every officer under his future command deserved fairness, accountability, and leadership grounded in principle instead of pride. Those values had shaped every promotion he had earned, every difficult investigation he had supervised, and every community meeting where listening had mattered more than speaking. Before entering the vehicle, his phone vibrated softly. The screen displayed the name of Deputy Commissioner Laura Mitchell. Marcus answered with his usual calm tone. "Good morning." Laura sounded optimistic. "Good morning, Marcus. I just wanted to make sure everything is still on schedule. The appointment begins at 9 o'clock sharp. The commissioner and the command staff are already preparing the conference room." Marcus smiled faintly. "I will be there on time." Laura hesitated for a moment before adding, "Today is important for everyone. The department needs steady leadership." Marcus looked across the quiet parking lot before responding. "The department deserves trust. Everything else comes after that." They exchanged a few final details before ending the call. At no point did either of them mention his new position directly. There would be time for formal introductions once the official ceremony began inside police headquarters. Marcus placed the phone in the center console and quietly reflected on the journey that had brought him there. He remembered beginning his career walking neighborhood patrols where every conversation mattered. He remembered working long nights as a detective, learning that evidence always outlasted assumptions. He remembered mentoring young officers who believed compassion and professionalism could exist together. Those lessons had shaped him far more than rank ever could. The Lamborghini itself often attracted attention, although Marcus rarely thought about it. He had purchased it only after decades of careful financial planning, successful investments, and years of disciplined saving. To strangers, it appeared to be a symbol of wealth. To Marcus, it represented patience rewarded through honest work. He climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, and entered the destination into the navigation system even though he already knew the route. Traffic reports predicted a smooth drive across town, giving him more than enough time to arrive early. As the engine started almost silently, he took one slow breath and pulled onto the street. He had no escort. No marked vehicles accompanied him. No public announcement had yet revealed why he was coming to Raleigh that morning. He preferred it that way. Respect earned through position alone could disappear as quickly as a title changed. Respect earned through character lasted much longer. Unaware that within less than an hour one routine traffic stop would become the first unexpected challenge of his new chapter, Marcus drove steadily toward police headquarters, believing the most important meeting of his day still lay ahead. Officer Ryan Coleman had built a reputation inside the department as someone who trusted his instincts more than paperwork. During nearly 12 years in uniform, he had made several legitimate arrests that earned praise from supervisors, and those successes gradually convinced him that he could recognize suspicious behavior within seconds. Unfortunately, confidence had quietly evolved into certainty, and certainty left very little room for questions. To Coleman, experience no longer served as a guide. It had become a substitute for evidence. That Tuesday morning began like dozens before it. He arrived at the precinct shortly before sunrise, exchanged greetings with a few fellow officers, collected his patrol equipment, and reviewed the shift briefing with only half his attention. The report mentioned increased traffic near downtown because of several scheduled government meetings, but nothing suggested unusual criminal activity. Officer Daniel Harris noticed Coleman checking his reflection while adjusting his badge before they walked toward their patrol vehicle. Harris had worked alongside Coleman for almost 3 years and understood both his strengths and his weaknesses. Coleman was decisive, energetic, and willing to respond quickly when others hesitated. At the same time, Harris had seen more than one situation where his partner reached conclusions before gathering all the facts. It had never created a serious problem before, but Harris often wondered how long that streak of good fortune could continue. Their patrol route carried them through several busy commercial districts where expensive restaurants, law offices, and luxury apartments attracted a wide variety of drivers every morning. For nearly an hour, nothing unusual happened. They assisted one stranded motorist, directed traffic around a construction zone, and answered a minor call about an illegally parked delivery truck. Everything pointed toward an uneventful shift until the black Lamborghini appeared several vehicles ahead. Coleman immediately focused on it. Something about the combination of the luxury vehicle and the black man behind the wheel caused an old assumption to surface without invitation. Instead of questioning that assumption, he accepted it as fact before speaking a single word to the driver. Harris glanced toward the vehicle and quietly examined what he could actually observe. The driver maintained the speed limit. Every lane change was properly signaled. The registration plate appeared valid. There were no equipment violations, no reckless maneuvers, and no obvious traffic offenses. "I do not see anything wrong," Harris said evenly. Coleman continued following the vehicle. "Sometimes you have to look beyond what everyone else sees." Harris rested one arm against the window. "Or maybe there is nothing to see." Coleman shook his head. "People do not usually end up driving something like that by accident." Harris turned to face his partner. "Neither do doctors, attorneys, business owners, or athletes. A nice vehicle is not probable cause." Coleman barely acknowledged the comment. In his mind, he had already written the beginning of a story, and every mile they traveled only reinforced his confidence that he would eventually prove himself right. Harris watched the Lamborghini continue through traffic without a single violation and felt increasingly uncomfortable. Good police work depended on facts that could withstand scrutiny, not assumptions that simply felt convincing. As Marcus Bennett approached the next major intersection, completely focused on arriving at police headquarters ahead of schedule, Coleman activated the emergency lights. The bright flashes reflected across nearby storefront windows, and traffic immediately slowed. Harris let out a quiet breath, realizing that whatever happened next would depend less on the law than on whether his partner was willing to question the conclusion he had already made. Marcus Bennett stepped out of the Lamborghini with deliberate composure, closing the driver's side door gently behind him before turning to face Officer Ryan Coleman. His hands remained visible at his sides, and his expression revealed neither irritation nor fear. Years of public service had taught him that moments of tension often exposed far more about the people asking the questions than the person expected to answer them. Coleman stopped several feet away and studied Marcus from head to toe before speaking again. "License, registration, and proof of insurance." Marcus nodded once without argument. "Certainly, officer." He reached carefully into his inside jacket pocket, retrieved his wallet, and then opened the vehicle door just enough to remove the registration documents from the center console. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and easy to follow. Harris quietly observed from behind, noticing how cooperative the driver had been from the very beginning. Marcus handed over each document with a polite smile. Coleman examined the driver's license for several moments before comparing it to the registration. Everything matched perfectly. The Lamborghini was legally registered to Marcus Bennett. The insurance was current. There were no outstanding alerts attached to the license plate. Even the driver's record returned without incident when Coleman entered the information into his mobile computer. Harris glanced toward the screen and spoke quietly enough that only Coleman could hear. "Everything checks out." Coleman remained silent for several seconds. The facts in front of him did not support the conclusion he had already reached, but instead of reconsidering his assumptions, he searched for another justification. He looked back toward the vehicle and slowly walked around it, inspecting every panel as though expecting hidden evidence to appear if he looked long enough. Marcus remained exactly where he had been instructed to stand. Passing motorists slowed slightly, curious about the luxury vehicle parked beside the road. A few pedestrians walking nearby glanced over before continuing toward downtown offices. Coleman returned and folded his arms. "I am going to search the vehicle." Marcus looked at him calmly. "May I ask on what legal basis?" The question was respectful, without sarcasm or confrontation. Coleman answered immediately. "I believe there could be evidence connected to criminal activity." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Based on what specific facts?" Harris shifted uneasily. He knew that question deserved an objective answer. Instead, Coleman replied with growing impatience. "I am asking the questions." Marcus maintained steady eye contact without raising his voice. "Officer, I have fully cooperated. My documents are valid, and I have followed every instruction. I would simply like to understand the reason." Coleman interpreted the calm response as resistance rather than professionalism. "If you have nothing to hide, then this should not be a problem." Marcus paused briefly before answering. "Respectfully, constitutional rights do not depend on whether someone has something to hide." Harris looked toward his partner again. "Ryan," he said quietly, "we have not established probable cause." Coleman ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Marcus, convinced that persistence alone would eventually justify the stop. The growing number of curious onlookers only strengthened his determination. He believed walking away now would make him appear uncertain. Marcus noticed the subtle change in Coleman's posture and understood that logic alone would not resolve the situation. Even so, his voice remained measured. "Officer, are you certain this is the decision you want to make?" Coleman answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." Marcus gave a slow nod, almost as though he had expected that response from the very beginning. "Very well," he said quietly. "Please remember that every decision made today will eventually be reviewed exactly as it happened." Officer Ryan Coleman walked toward the Lamborghini with the confidence of someone who believed the next few minutes would validate every assumption he had already made. He looked back once at Marcus Bennett, who remained standing exactly where he had been instructed, his posture relaxed and his expression composed. There was no sign of frustration, no raised voice, and no attempt to interfere. Marcus simply watched in silence, almost as though he understood that some lessons could not be prevented, only witnessed. Officer Daniel Harris followed several steps behind Coleman, his concern becoming more difficult to hide. "Ryan," he said in a low voice, "we have verified his identification, the registration, and the insurance. We have not found anything that justifies going further." Coleman did not slow down. "You are worrying too much." Harris glanced toward the growing number of people walking past the scene. Several had stopped across the street, quietly watching. Others held their phones at chest level, recording from a distance without saying a word. Coleman opened the driver's side door and began looking through the cabin. The interior was immaculate. Every document inside the center console was neatly organized. There were business cards, a notebook, a charging cable, and nothing remotely unusual. He checked beneath the seats, inside the storage compartments, and throughout the rear passenger area with increasing determination. Every place he searched produced the same result. Nothing. Marcus remained patient, never taking his eyes off the scene. Harris folded his arms and quietly observed the search, hoping his partner would recognize that the situation had already gone far beyond what good judgment required. Instead, Coleman moved toward the rear cargo compartment and opened it. Inside sat a carefully packed garment bag, a briefcase, a small overnight suitcase, and a polished leather portfolio. Coleman opened the suitcase. Inside were neatly folded dress shirts, polished shoes, and travel items arranged with military precision. He examined the garment bag next. It contained an expensive dark suit protected inside a garment cover. There was nothing suspicious. He then opened the leather portfolio. Harris leaned slightly closer, expecting official paperwork or business documents. Inside were meeting notes, leadership materials, and several neatly organized folders bearing the seal of the Raleigh Police Department. Coleman paused for only a second before closing the portfolio again, apparently more interested in continuing the search than reading what was directly in front of him. Harris noticed the department seal immediately. "Ryan," he said carefully, "that looks official." Coleman dismissed the observation with a shrug. "Anybody can carry paperwork." Harris looked back toward Marcus, who simply stood quietly beneath the shade of the nearby oak trees. There was no anger in his face, only a calm patience that somehow made the entire situation feel even more uncomfortable. After several more minutes, Coleman finally stepped away from the vehicle. He had found nothing illegal, nothing stolen, and nothing that supported the suspicions that had initiated the stop. Even so, his confidence refused to disappear. Instead, it transformed into irritation. Marcus waited until Coleman closed the cargo compartment before speaking in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. "Officer, since your search has concluded, may I make a brief work-related phone call?" Coleman studied him for a moment before answering. "Make it quick." Marcus nodded politely, reached into his jacket pocket, and removed his phone. He selected a contact without hesitation and held the device to his ear. When the call connected, his voice remained steady and professional. "Good morning. This is Marcus Bennett. I have encountered an unexpected delay on my way to headquarters. I believe someone there should be informed." He listened quietly for several seconds before adding only one more sentence. "Yes, I will remain exactly where I am until someone arrives." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and looked calmly toward the city skyline while, only moments later, the first unfamiliar voice began speaking across police radios throughout the district. Marcus Bennett slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket with the same quiet confidence that had defined every action he had taken since the traffic stop began. He did not explain who he had called, nor did he make any attempt to impress the officers standing before him. Instead, he simply returned to waiting, his eyes calmly following the steady movement of morning traffic as though time itself had become his greatest ally. Officer Ryan Coleman folded his arms and let out a faint laugh. "That phone call is not going to change anything," he said with unmistakable confidence. "People think they can make one call, and suddenly the rules do not apply." Marcus turned toward him with a calm expression. "I agree, officer. The rules should apply equally to everyone." The answer caught Coleman off guard for only a moment before he dismissed it with a shrug. Harris remained silent. Something about Marcus's composure continued to trouble him. Most people placed under unexpected scrutiny became defensive, frustrated, or anxious. Marcus had displayed none of those emotions. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet patience of someone who understood exactly how the situation would eventually unfold. Less than a minute passed before the familiar crackle of the patrol radio interrupted the silence. Dispatch called for available units to remain clear of the area surrounding police headquarters due to the arrival of senior command staff. Coleman glanced toward the radio without much interest. High-ranking officials visited headquarters often enough that the announcement hardly seemed unusual. Harris listened more carefully. Another transmission followed almost immediately. "All supervisors, please acknowledge. Command staff arrival is imminent. Maintain open communications." Coleman returned the microphone to its holder. "Busy morning," he muttered. Marcus remained perfectly still. His expression never changed. Then another voice came across the radio, this one noticeably more formal. "Attention all units in District 3. Be advised that the Commissioner's motorcade has departed headquarters ahead of schedule. Stand by for further instructions." Harris slowly looked toward Marcus before turning back to Coleman. "That seems unusual." Coleman waved away the observation. "Probably another city meeting." Several pedestrians had now gathered near the sidewalk, quietly watching the scene unfold from a respectful distance. A delivery driver paused beside his truck. Two office workers whispered to one another while pretending to check their phones. The atmosphere had changed in a way that no one could fully explain. It was no longer simply a traffic stop. It felt like the beginning of something larger. Another radio transmission broke the silence. "Unit 12, confirm your current location." Coleman immediately reached for the microphone. "Unit 12, traffic stop on Jefferson Avenue near 4th Street." There was a brief pause before dispatch answered. "Remain at your current location. Senior Command is responding directly to you." Coleman frowned. "Responding to me?" "Affirmative. Do not clear the scene." Harris slowly lowered his eyes. "Ryan, Senior Command does not respond personally to routine traffic stops." Coleman attempted a confident smile, but it did not come naturally this time. "Maybe somebody important is nearby." Marcus quietly checked the time on his watch before looking toward the distant intersection. Within moments, the faint sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the morning streets. One unmarked black sedan appeared first, followed by another, then two marked command vehicles with emergency lights activated but sirens silent. Traffic began moving aside without hesitation. Every officer on scene instinctively straightened their posture. Harris recognized the lead vehicle immediately. It belonged to the office of the police commissioner. Coleman stared at the approaching convoy, his earlier confidence beginning to fade as every vehicle rolled to a controlled stop directly beside the black Lamborghini. And before a single door even opened, Marcus Bennett stood waiting with the same calm dignity he had shown from the very beginning. The doors of the lead sedan opened almost in unison, and several senior officials stepped onto the sidewalk with calm urgency. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere surrounding the traffic stop. Uniformed command officers moved with quiet purpose rather than confusion, each one scanning the scene before directing their attention toward the man standing beside the black Lamborghini. Officer Ryan Coleman instinctively straightened his uniform and took a half step forward, expecting to explain why senior leadership had arrived. Before he could speak, Police Commissioner Harold Whitaker walked directly past him without slowing down. Deputy Commissioner Laura Mitchell followed only a few steps behind, accompanied by two assistant chiefs and several command staff members. None of them looked at Coleman first. Every one of them approached Marcus Bennett. Harris watched in complete silence as Commissioner Whitaker extended his hand with genuine respect. "Good morning, Marcus. I am very sorry that your first morning in Raleigh began this way." Marcus accepted the handshake with a calm smile. "Good morning, Commissioner. I appreciate you coming personally." Laura Mitchell offered a respectful nod. "Congratulations, Chief. We were expecting to welcome you at headquarters, not on the side of Jefferson Avenue." The single word seemed to drain every remaining trace of confidence from Coleman's face. "Chief." He looked from Marcus to the commissioner, then back again, trying to convince himself he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Harris lowered his eyes briefly before looking at Marcus once more. The leadership materials inside the leather portfolio suddenly made perfect sense. The early morning phone call, the quiet confidence, the remarkable patience. None of it had been an act. Commissioner Whitaker finally turned toward Coleman. His expression remained controlled, but the disappointment in his eyes required no explanation. "Officer Coleman," he said evenly, "allow me to introduce Chief Marcus Bennett, who officially assumes leadership of this department today." The words settled over the scene with complete silence. Even the small group of bystanders watching from across the street seemed to recognize that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Coleman struggled to respond. "Sir, I did not know." Marcus answered before the commissioner could speak. His voice remained measured and respectful. "No, officer, you did not. My position was never the issue." Coleman looked at him without speaking. Marcus continued calmly. "Every person you stop deserves to be treated fairly before you know anything about who they are. Whether they are a teacher, a mechanic, a business owner, or the next police chief should never determine the quality of their treatment." Harris quietly lowered his head, recognizing that the lesson reached far beyond everyone standing on that sidewalk. Commissioner Whitaker glanced toward the open Lamborghini, then toward the patrol vehicle. "Has the stop been documented?" Harris answered honestly. "Yes, sir. The body cameras have remained active throughout the encounter." Whitaker nodded once. "Good. The facts will speak for themselves." Marcus looked at Coleman with neither anger nor satisfaction. There was no desire to embarrass him publicly. Instead, there was only disappointment that an encounter which should have reflected professionalism had become something entirely different. He gently adjusted his jacket and looked toward police headquarters in the distance before speaking one final sentence. "Leadership is not measured by how we treat the most important person we meet. It is measured by how we treat the person we believe has no authority at all." No one answered. In the quiet that followed, even Coleman understood that the greatest mistake he had made that morning was never failing to recognize the new chief. It was failing to recognize the equal dignity of the man standing in front of him long before he knew who he was. The drive to police headquarters was unusually quiet. Marcus Bennett rode with Commissioner Harold Whitaker while the command vehicles followed behind, leaving the morning traffic stop as little more than another intersection for everyone else. Yet for those who had witnessed it, the encounter would remain impossible to forget. Inside the conference room, the scheduled welcome ceremony was postponed without discussion. Instead, senior leadership gathered around a long table where professionalism required that the events of the morning be examined carefully and objectively. Marcus took the same seat that had been prepared for him before sunrise, but he did not begin by discussing policies, budgets, or future initiatives. His first official conversation centered on accountability. Commissioner Whitaker opened the meeting with measured honesty. "The department cannot ask this community to trust us if we are unwilling to examine ourselves with the same standard." No one disagreed. Within the hour, Internal Affairs formally opened a review. Body camera recordings from both officers were secured. Dashboard camera footage was preserved. Traffic cameras covering Jefferson Avenue were requested. Dispatch recordings documenting every radio transmission were archived. Statements were scheduled from Officer Ryan Coleman, Officer Daniel Harris, and every available witness. The process moved forward according to department policy, not personal emotion. Marcus insisted upon that distinction from the very beginning. "This review is not about revenge," he told the investigative team. "It is about facts. The facts deserve our full attention." Harris provided his statement with complete transparency. He described the initial stop, His repeated observations that Marcus had committed no visible traffic violation, his concerns regarding the justification for expanding the encounter, and his recommendation that the situation end after all documentation had been verified. He neither exaggerated nor minimized what had happened. He simply reported what he had seen. Coleman also gave his statement. Gone was the certainty that had defined his actions only hours earlier. He acknowledged that Marcus had cooperated throughout the encounter, that all identifying documents had been valid, and that the vehicle search had produced no evidence of criminal activity. When investigators asked why he believed additional action had been necessary after every record check came back clean, his answer grew noticeably uncertain. Meanwhile, investigators compared each statement against the video recordings. Every important moment appeared exactly as the cameras had captured it. Marcus remained respectful. Harris consistently urged caution. Coleman repeatedly relied on assumptions rather than observable facts. The recordings required no interpretation beyond what they plainly showed. Later that afternoon, Marcus stood alone in his new office overlooking the city skyline. The room still contained unopened boxes from the previous administration, and his name had not yet been placed on the office door. Laura Mitchell stepped inside, carrying several folders before stopping near the entrance. "You could have handled this very differently," she said quietly. Marcus looked out the window for a moment before answering. "If this becomes about me, everyone learns the wrong lesson." Laura nodded thoughtfully. "And what lesson do you want them to learn?" Marcus turned back toward her with the same calm expression that had carried him through the entire day. "That our badge is never a license to assume. It is a promise to verify, to listen, and to treat every person with equal dignity before reaching any conclusion." Laura closed the folder in her hands and smiled faintly. "Then perhaps your first day has already begun changing this department." Marcus glanced once more toward the city below, knowing that real reform would never begin with speeches alone. It would begin whenever every officer understood that fairness must come before assumptions, because justice loses its meaning the moment appearances become more powerful than the truth. 3 weeks later, the city had almost forgotten the traffic stop that briefly interrupted an ordinary Tuesday morning, but inside the Raleigh Police Department, its impact continued to shape conversations, decisions, and expectations. The internal affairs investigation concluded with a detailed report supported by body camera recordings, dispatch communications, witness statements, and department policy. The findings were clear. Officer Ryan Coleman had expanded a lawful traffic stop beyond what the available facts justified and had allowed personal assumptions to influence professional judgment. The department responded according to established procedures, and Coleman was no longer assigned to patrol duties while the final administrative process reached its conclusion. Marcus Bennett never requested a specific outcome. From the beginning, he insisted that every decision belonged to the established process rather than personal opinion. To many officers, that restraint became more memorable than the investigation itself. They expected anger. They expected public embarrassment. Instead, they witnessed leadership built upon consistency. During his first department-wide address as police chief, Marcus stood before several hundred officers gathered inside the Academy auditorium. There were veteran detectives, rookie recruits, dispatch supervisors, community outreach coordinators, and command staff seated together under the same roof. The atmosphere was quiet, not because people feared what he might say, but because they genuinely wanted to hear it. Marcus looked across the room before speaking in the calm voice that had never changed throughout the events of his first day. "Every badge in this room represents authority," he began. "But authority alone has never earned public trust. Trust begins with fairness. It grows through professionalism. It survives only when our decisions are guided by facts instead of assumptions." The auditorium remained completely silent. No one checked a phone. No one whispered. Every officer listened. Marcus continued. "Most people we meet will never know our names after a single encounter. They will remember only how we treated them. That memory becomes their definition of this department. We decide every day whether that definition will be respect or disappointment." Several officers exchanged thoughtful glances. Harris, seated among them, recognized those words as the same principles Marcus had demonstrated beside the roadway weeks earlier. They were not carefully prepared lines written for a ceremony. They reflected the way he had actually lived under pressure. In the months that followed, The department introduced additional training focused on constitutional policing, professional communication, and decision-making grounded in objective evidence. Veteran officers participated alongside new recruits, reinforcing the idea that learning did not end with experience. Community meetings became more frequent. Conversations grew more open. Small improvements gradually rebuilt confidence where doubt had once existed. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through headquarters, he paused beside the framed mission statement displayed near the main entrance. Visitors passed by without realizing how closely those words had already been tested. He smiled quietly before continuing toward his office, knowing that genuine leadership would always be measured one decision at a time rather than by titles printed on a door. The morning that began with suspicion had ended by revealing something much greater than hidden authority. It had revealed that true justice does not arrive because someone powerful demands it. It arrives when someone principled refuses to abandon it, even when they have every opportunity to do otherwise. Because in the end, the strongest badge is never the one pinned to a uniform. It is the character carried by the person wearing it. And while power can command attention for a moment, only integrity earns respect that lasts long after the flashing lights have disappeared.